so the plan assumes that we will be releasing water during the summer from Lake Oroville than would have been than that agreement would have had us do. So it's important then to kind of take a look at what some of the consequences of that are. What we do plan, the plan does show us dropping Oroville down to 900,000 acre feet. And sooner than last year. This is actually a pretty good graph because you can see that 900,000 essentially meets the historical low points for Oroville. So back in 1977, if you look on the far left-hand side, this would be around October, November of 77, and also last year, a little bit later in the fall. The plan this year is we would be hitting that target a little earlier than last year. So by the end of September, we would be probably at least 100,000 acre feet lower than we were last year. But some of the effects here, so for example, is it's likely to squeeze out some of the, to a large extent, if not all, of the rice decomp water that would also be used for waterfowl habitat. So that's one of the consequences of this earlier reduction in storage. It's also putting additional risk on that carryover storage into next year. One of the things that's sort of significant about that 900,000 acre feet is that much lower than that, and we're operating to, we've dropped below the level of our intakes for our power plant, and we're down to only one single release point from the lake. And so, you know, that also greatly reduces our capacity to make releases should they be needed for the Delta or what have you later. It's also, I think this chart here also represents what could happen in a very dry year. If you take a look at the red with the dots, that's the 1977 trace for Oroville storage. You can see from the beginning of the water year to the end of the water year, we actually drafted about 850,000 acre feet out of storage. And that was, in that year, if you also recall, we had rock barriers were installed to help with the meeting the salinity in the Delta. So, you know, this is, we talked about hard stops. That's essentially why we're considering that storage there as a hard stop as it relates to Lake Oroville operations.
Well, let me just ask a question. I do have Assemblymember Mathis here. Would you like to speak before we continue, or you can leave it to you? Sometimes people want to stay for a while, but I know you have a very tough schedule.
No, I'll go ahead and speak now. Okay. Thank you. Madam Chair and board members, thank you for the opportunity to speak today about the most important issue facing our state in generations. My name is Devin Mathis, and I am the Assemblyman for the 26th District, which covers Tulare County, Inyo County, and part of Kern County. Madam Chair, my district literally has ran dry. I have over 10,000 residents in Tulare County that do not have water to cook with, to bathe their children, or to even flush a toilet. These families have to go down to a church parking lot just to take a shower. I believe this is due to the fact that Tulare County and my district, this area, has had a 0% allocation of surface water for the last 2 years, which has led to these conditions. I understand that you all are here to keep our most precious resource and to look at the best ways of spending it and allocating it. I ask that in the next moves and the next steps that your committee takes, that you guys look at putting people first and these communities first and prioritizing that over other things. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Our next slide is Folsom Lake. So again, the blue area is our average to date. And then our black trace is last year, and our blue trace is our current year. So we're looking at about 450,000 acre feet. And with that, there we go. Turn it over to John for any follow-up comments.
Yeah, I'll just be very brief here. Just want to give time for Ron on the temperature plan. Just the only comment I think, and your staff has gone over where we are on the process for TUCP. The only thing I want to note is that, you know, we have our petition in front of the executive director right now. Just a point to be aware of is this, the temperature plan, the revised temperature plan, and the effects on the entire system assumes approval of our current petition for July through the end of the year. So that's just one aspect to keep in mind as we move forward. And I'll just leave it at that for now.
Thanks for putting that Save Our Water slide in. That's always have to have that.
Good morning. This is Ron Milligan with Bureau Reclamation. I'm the operations manager for the CVP. I'm going to run through a few slides talking about modifications we've been discussing with board staff as well as fishery agencies and with a whole host of our stakeholders, both in the fishery community as well as many of our individual areas related to agriculture. Just in the spirit of the theme earlier, in Eleanor Roosevelt quote category, it kind of reminded of, you know, strength and tea and hot water, and you never know how strong you are until you get into it. So with that, we'll go ahead and get into this, and I probably got more to say than I've got slides, which certainly can fill in with any questions. Borrowing from one of Bill's slides, this was just the trace of our storage at Shasta both this year and last year, and I've kind of put a dotted line into where our current thinking would be in terms of in a landing spot in terms of where I think we will end up with what we're contemplating right now with our plan, at least as it gets to the end of September. A lot of discussion has been made about this is a couple 100,000 to 250,000 less than the plan that we had talked about back in May, and I think that as I get towards the end of this, that provides an opportunity to try to make things meet and to be creative out of the box. There's a lot of potential for partnering as the year has developed. I think particularly you see a lot of working together within the agricultural communities and in the M&I water users community. We've had a lot of discussions, and a lot of our ability to have flex in this particular area relates to how we might operate at this particular juncture in the October timeframe, after we've done our business with the temperatures as a first order issue on the upper Sacramento. So that's kind of a key piece of collateral, if you will. Just to put this in perspective, what we're seeing, I mean, John talked about 900,000 acre feet at Oroville. We've heard discussion already about 120,000 acre feet at Folsom. The Trinity Lake is going to be probably less than 600,000. So when you start collecting up all of these storages, I'm sure San Luis storage by the time we get to the end of the summer is going to be low. You almost have to combine all of those things to get to this 1.4 million acre feet. So a lot of the water has been kind of repositioned in Shasta so that we can work through a temperature plan on the upper part of the river. I've taken one of the graphs that innovatively have been put together by board staff.
Yours is prettier.
Well, I appreciate, thank you. I did find the board's presentation maybe a little, I was stunned by it when I first saw it. I thought that was very nice. But we kind of subdivided that a little bit more because I think there's a couple of little finer points here I wanted to kind of get at. One aspect is in these lower level temperatures, let's say if you look over to the right from 50 degrees and below, some of the earlier plot you saw was kind of those blocks were in 2-degree blocks. And we've kind of subdivided that into 1 degree because the shift that we've talked about between what we thought we knew in the April timeframe versus getting into May were kind of just under 1 degree. And that may not sound like a lot, but in this business with this particular lake configuration, that was a big deal. So this gives you a little bit of more resolution there. The other thing is I think this is one more of those 2-week profiles that from the one plot that you had. And we're starting to see a little bit of the actions that we've been working with in May and through June now, which are less releases, and they have some other effects that we can talk about. And managing to a warmer temperature, not with the idea that we've got a long haul here with a lot of cold water and still very early in the spawning season. So that allowed us, and I'll talk a little more about saving some cold water. You're starting to see a little more separation between those two profiles. When we did this kind of side by side, let's say 3 weeks ago, it looked like they were just matching right up and you were on a slide right down to the same place you were a year ago. Now we're seeing, given some of the actions we're taking, some additional building of some cold water, at least in that 60 degree below, which allows us to do some blending. I threw this slide in. It's, it's kind of a similar or different way of looking at the previous slide. These are just some plots by elevation and temperature of the pool. And this is just indicative of the question that came up about a probe and measurement of this cold water. And, are we confident enough as we move forward as we're kind of working on this plan? So what we have here is kind of asked staff to pull some selective of the profiles just to get kind of a spatial distribution. I have 10 lines on here. But in the February, March, April timeframe that we have, you had some, and I'll ask you to kind of focus on that elevation 800 and below for right now. You see a fairly tight grouping there. And that's typically what we would see as the lake begins to warm from the beginning you're on. That deep in the lake is usually a pretty stable area. And that grouping doesn't look too unusual. Then when we've had a course correction of some of the instrumentation, we've had 3 that are in a very tight grouping, but about 1 degree warmer. And that's been one of the main drivers as to why we have a different plan that we're going to have to work with, because we were, given the low lake levels, on a very tight budget, so to speak, and a need to do something different. If we continued with the plan we had in May, both from a flow release standpoint and a temperature standpoint, we would have most likely run out of water pretty quickly. And some of when we plugged in the new, our first from the operations staff standpoint, where we realized that there was a problem with the profile, was when we took these newer profiles, put them into the model, and we're getting very radically different results than we had the month before when we were doing the model runs. And we kind of traced it back to this particular time. So that's, so one of the keys as we talk about moving forward is how do we know that we're, as we track things, one of the key aspects is, well, how's the cold water pool developing or depleting as we move through the summer? One of them is going to be checking back and see how, does it seem reasonable the way it's tracking? We are working on some real-time deployment of some sensors that with NOAA Fisheries to be able to get some real-time data, to be able to track this, to see if anything unusual is occurring. And I think that would be very helpful. There'll be some other things that I'll talk about further downstream, but kind of monitoring the connection of what's going on in the pool is going to be very important. I think as we also monitor tracking of the water, that the temperature of the water coming through the dam, through the control device, is also another way to see if things are anything unusual occurs and being on top of that quickly. Just as
I'm sorry, could you,
Sure.
maybe you'll touch upon this later, but I'm still unclear as to what happened between May 20th and May 29th, or in this case, I guess May 26th, that resulted in this awakening by the Bureau with respect to temperature.
Typically, in this particular time of the year, from April to May, we would update our forecasts of operations, system-wide on a monthly basis. And, this kind of ties into work that the Department of Water Resources would do. One of the main drivers there is typically, and we've talked about this a lot, well, what's the projected runoff, both at 90% exceedance, 50% exceedance? And that's typically the schedule that we're on into then take additional information about a profile, take the new runoff information that we have, team that up with the latest profile, and rerun our operational forecasts, and then true up with our temperature runs to see if those flows. If we need to make adjustments to the releases, then we would do that to kind of balance delta operations along with state operations because of the hydrology. Once we've done that, then we'll go back and recheck to see how we might need to refine our adjustments as it turns to temperatures. It was at that time when we had input the raw data of the different temperature profile that, which wasn't until around towards the end of May that we were finding that we were having trouble getting the same results that we had, which was meet 56 degrees at the Clear Creek gauge or the CCR gauge. And it took probably a week or so to get back to, okay, why weren't we getting the same model results or something similar? It became apparent that the input data there was not useful. So it was, at that time...
Sorry, the input data, which input data? And
Well,
when was it inputted, and how was that data generated or screened?
The one graph that Les had, which was just a one-page sheet of data as it relates to temperatures, and like that is, in essence, a input to the temperature model that's used to kind of define how the lake would stratify as you continue on through the year, and then how you would operate the temperature control device, and then hit a compliance target. So it was around mid-month that we were using some of that data, and we determined that it was the input file for this particular component, because there's an array of input that go with this, that was obviously different than the month before. Our next step was, okay, well, why is it different? Was that a bad data set? So then we redeployed folks into the field to say, would you take a new profile so we can see if we just got a bad set of numbers, because it did have a very unusual shift up and down. And then at that point in time, we, and all this is happening right before Memorial Day weekend, to triple cross-check that, had equipment from Folsom come up and take a side-by-side profile. It was concluded that what we had was a bad data set from the previous months, even though they were collectively for several months, not necessarily unusually looking data, but were off a particular degree in this particular case, coupled with conditions that transpired over that month, which had to do with warmer temperatures, lack of snow runoff as well, that accumulated into about a degree difference there. So at that particular point, we were able to define that, yes, we had a bad data set back in the April run, and that this new data was probably more accurate.
I have a question, just because I think this is building on the importance of updating information when we have it. So our question is, when the data set that I showed also were based on profiles from April 28th and May 13th, which aren't shown on your graph. So are those with the May 13th and the April 28th, are they closer in temperature profile to the April or to the May? I think that, because I mean, yeah,
the May 13th certainly is closer to the new data, but that was the first time we had actually used that in the run, and had then said, let's get to the bottom of this, and send guys back out in the field, and actually the point of actually buying a new probe to be able to go out. So we had tested this particular from end of May on with brand new equipment, not just a recalibrated probe that had given us some bad readings. And we've been getting a fairly close cluster here since then.
So do I take it that you had data from the collected from May 13th, yet you did not model that data? Therefore, when you came before us on May 20th, it was based on April data, which does not show the deteriorating condition that was reflected in the May 13th data sets.
That's right. And at that particular point, we were still, it wasn't until after that when we were trying to decipher why we weren't getting the same kind of temperature model results that about that time, then we were sending folks back out in the field to recalibrate. So that was around the 27th, 28th, and 29th.
Just if you may, a follow-up question. April 28th, there was another reading as well, not shown on here. So I guess the question would be, what was April 28th showing in terms of temperature profiles?
And I don't have that here, but it may have been probably a bit transitional in this particular regard. But that wasn't necessarily a data set that we were using for the model run. When we, as I said, when we would then use the data was about a monthly time step, probably more interested in what the new runoff data was going to show. And then that was when we picked up the May 13th data to use it in terms of the model.
Well, this certainly raises a red flag, since apparently you had later April as well as May data that were not used in modeling runs in making your report to us on May 20th and assuring us that the temperature control would be met.
That's correct. We had that, but you know, it was certainly.
And why was the data not used?
Well, we were still in the midst of running that, and it would have been using, rather than use the data, taking that data and using April data in terms of what were probably, from our perspective, also critical information like new runoff information that would have probably necessitated some adjustments to outflow potentially or releases at Keswick, that we did not use that information to rerun the model until we were later into the month.
Well, I think regardless of whatever action the executive director takes, one of the things that I would expect in the future is when the projects report to this board, that they do so based on the most current available data that they have, and not just on whatever you believe is most convenient.
Well, it's a very good point, but I wouldn't say it's the most convenient, but certainly what we had is we thought was a complete picture at the time.
Can you talk about, I think and obviously this question and ones like it appear in the comments, and undoubtedly we'll hear some of it today as well. Looking forward, what assurance can you give us that you've taken action so that this real-time monitoring that the new plan suggests is likely to be more up to speed? Have you fixed the problem that you found, or are you going to be sampling more often? Or I think that's a question of assurance that
Sure.
folks are going to want to have, since you're proposing to cut it even closer to the bone.
Yeah, in terms of when we're at the 2-week interval making additional runs, which is typically the case in the summer, you certainly have those. We have a benchmark at the end of May now with a number of devices. And at this particular part of the lake, you've got something to be able to look at and measure from. I think that the other real-time sensors that are being discussed in deploying is a different kind of technology. I kind of expect that we'll probably need to have a period where it's going to be a calibration question. And maybe the real-time stuff will have some flutters to it that we'll have to try to figure out. But at that particular point in time, you at least have something to be able to see if there's something that's drifted off, in particular of the key more traditional profile that involves a person going out in the boat and taking a sounding. The other thing that's more in terms of the temperature season is you're actually working temperatures through the temperature control device, that you're actually measuring those temperatures on each of the units and looking at the temperatures in the tail bay within Keswick. coming out of the power plant. And that also is a measure of, does that seem to make sense in terms of how the blending is occurring? I think going forward into, let's say next year, we're having some discussions within a group that I was going to describe between reclamation and NOAA fisheries to think about what kinds of tools on the early part of the season would be useful in trying to project out when we sit in the February, March timeframe to what to think about temperatures and what's achievable and not achievable when making some decisions about water allocations and operations and commitments going forward. Is it the same tool that you use in the midst of the summer and make a very detailed run, or there's some other parameters that you could look at? And again, the key here is, do you have the redundancies to kind of cross-check?
Thank you for that. I want to just take a moment. I didn't want to interrupt that train of thought as Board Member Dodick was talking, but Senator Cannella has joined us, and I want to recognize the tightness of his schedule and allow him to speak. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, board members. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to address the board. The revised temperature plan for the Shasta River to increase and to manage the cold water pool at Shasta River for a longer period of time into the fall will cause a decrease in water availability to the Central Valley Water Project interest, including Sacramento River contractors and settlement holders, south of Delta contractors, exchange contractors, and municipal and industrial water users. For the past 2 months, south of Delta CVP contractors and exchange contractors have planned and relied upon the original temperature plan for decisions concerning cropping and water use. So to be clear, it's not like they thought they were getting zero water and moved forward anyway. They were told they were going to get a certain amount of water. Based on that, they planted their fields. And now they're in a position where they may get no water to their detriment. They plan on something now to their detriment, they may not get water. This radical reduction from the originally planned summer releases will seriously diminish previously anticipated pumping and potential reduces it to a zero or minimal amount. The circumstances imperils existing crops already planted and the viability of other water uses during the summer. There is already a projected shortfall of over 100,000 acre feet south of the Delta by the end of August to meet current crop requirements and other needs. This shortage would not occur absent the change in the temperature plan. Reduced Shasta outflows may also require reclamation and DWR, which operates the State Water Project, to release more water from Folsom Reservoir and Oroville Reservoir to repel salinity downstream in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. Water agencies in the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys provided estimates to reclamation indicating the total cost of lost water and farm production would be in the range of $3.9 billion to $4.9 billion, with an additional 500,000 acres of fallowed farmland. I represent the 12th Senate District, largely the Central Valley, Central Coast. And in the Central Valley, they rely on this water. And I'm telling you, there is an economic recovery in California. It's not in my district. My district is agricultural based. And if we lose another 500,000 acres of farmland, we're going to be in big trouble. We're going to see, I represent Mendota, Firebaugh, all the west side of Fresno, and it's already horrible over there. And it's going to just get worse if we don't do something to correct this. So I would just ask, look, it's not fish versus farmers. You guys are in a very difficult position, and I understand that. But there's got to be a way to balance the uses. Just to say we're not going to have any water, that's an easy thing to say. I don't think it's an easy decision to make, but it's an easy thing to say. But at what cost? At what cost to the district that I represent, to the farmers who thought they were getting some water? Now, I'm sorry that there was a problem with the calibration, but it certainly wasn't the farmer's fault. It was not the farmer's fault. They were not in charge of that. And to tell them that everything you've worked for your entire life is at jeopardy, I don't think is equitable. So there's got to be a way. We're smart people in California. We can figure this stuff out. If it's transfers at times when it's not going to hurt the fish, whatever, I know we can do this. I just ask that you guys would be committed to trying to figure out a way to, maybe everybody takes a little bit, but not just lay it on the farmer's responsibility, or their cost. So I don't envy the position you're in, but you knew when you took a seat on this board that you'd have to make those tough decisions. I just ask that you would keep it fair and balanced, because the way of life of many, many farmers in my district, many, many farm workers, many people that rely on agriculture are at stake here as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. I also have Assemblyman James Gallagher. Oh, there you are. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Chairman Marcus and members. I did want to come and speak to you. I know this is a very important issue, and I know that what you're grappling with is a very difficult issue as we're trying to figure out how to find our way through a very tough drought, the worst that we've seen in quite some time. But what I want to encourage you today is maybe I'm echoing some of the comments that were made by Senator Cannella, but to really encourage a much more balanced approach, and specifically with regard to managing flows in the Sacramento River and the decision to hold water in Shasta Dam. These suspended releases are having a pretty dramatic impact throughout the state. And I've said it many times, both in op-eds and on the assembly floor, agriculture has shouldered a pretty substantial burden of this drought going forward. Mandatory cutbacks starting not this year, but last year. 25% is really the minimum in many districts. 50% surface water cutbacks. In the case of Tehama Canal, 0% in my district. So very dramatic cutbacks that we've all experienced. And you guys know the numbers. Last year, 500,000 acres of prime farmland fallowed, resulting in a $2.2 billion loss to our economy, also putting 17,000 farm workers out of work in this state. And that, when we combine that, hey, look, there's been a whole lot of cutbacks to agriculture in this state. To do further damage to that, to do further restrictions, when we don't seem to be seeing the same cutbacks in environmental water, to me doesn't seem to be the most balanced approach.
You might want to stay and hear some of the speakers who will talk about the fish that are on the brink of extinction because of our cutbacks of water to fish too.
And I am definitely open to hearing the whole discussion. But, in a drought, especially, I think all the time in agriculture, but especially in a drought, certainty means everything. And there was a whole lot of people counting on this water. You're counting on every inch that you have. You're trying to find ways either through the surface water that you can get available, the flexibility that we've allowed in the system by allowing transfers. And even among agriculturists, as you know, we have been working to try and get water supplies to other farmers. Because we know this isn't just about, your individual farm, it's about the entire industry. And, so there were farmers down in the Central Valley who were relying on this water, on this, on really not a substantial amount of water, but every inch count, every amount of water you can get counts. And so having that certainty, but then to be told, oh, we're going to make an arbitrary decision to hold that water, and then now we're having a discussion about it, and I think that's good. But, in a way, the damage is already done. And, when people are relying on that water, when they've entered into contracts to help get that water over to them, when there's been a whole lot of time spent on that, only to have the rug pulled out from under you at the last second, I would argue is not the best way to manage things. And so what I'm asking for, and I understand you have many different things to consider, and then combined on that, and then we go into pre-1914 water rights, which is something that hasn't been done since the 70s. That's a pretty significant move when what I'm seeing is that I don't believe that the environmental water, which is 50% of the water in the state, that's the reality. And I'm going to keep saying it, agriculture is 40% of the water in the state, environmental water is 50% of the water in the state.
We could have a discussion about what that 50% is too. Just as the 80-20 isn't perhaps fair, the 50% is not all environmental regulation.
Well,
it includes salinity control, it includes a lot of things. But I'm happy to say, I don't want to argue with you here, it's just there are certain talking points and memes out there that are not fair on multiple sides. It's just very complicated.
Well, with respect, and I know we've had this discussion in the past, but I think it's important that we have this discussion now, and that we really come to a more balanced approach, and that's what I'm arguing for. As you know, ag has made sacrifices, is continuing to make sacrifices in this drought. Urban users too are making sacrifices with the mandatory cutbacks, minimum 25%, in many cases more. But we must enact responsible policies that require everyone to cut back, and that must include water set aside for environmental purposes. And ultimately, we do have to make priority decisions here. Differences of degrees in Fahrenheit in the water, and deciding to hold water back for that purposes, I don't think that's an issue that should trump this certainty that these farmers were relying upon. You know, I'm definitely open to having the discussion about, you know, the science and what that shows, and, you know, what that will mean if we release this water at this point. But, you know, at the end of the day, there's some very significant human priorities in this state that I think we should strongly consider. And I think we can consider those in this case over the difference in a few degrees in Fahrenheit in the water that's going to come down the Sacramento River. So again, with the future of California's economy and livelihood at stake, we cannot, you know, allow what I think is too far on this side of the equation, you know, too far swinging to this side of the balance to condemn the state to a future of continued water cuts and changes in what was certainty. You know, and creating this uncertainty statewide. We must change course and get serious about increasing water storage. We've talked about that before, and sharing, truly sharing the burden of this drought. And that's coming not from me alone, but from all my constituents who are dealing with this. And I think the voices of many people throughout this state are calling on you to make that balanced approach. So I thank you for your time again, and just ask for that consideration.
Thank you. That's what we're here for today.